Hello, my name is Spencer Hay. I'm the co-founder and chief science officer at Prism Bio. Welcome to Discussing Data Science. My guest today is Stephen Rosenfeld. Stephen is an executive board chair at North Star Review Board, which is a 501c3 nonprofit IRB based in Maine. He previously served as the chief information officer at the NIH Clinical Center, as well as Maine Health. And he was the president and CEO of Western IRB and much more. So if you care about clinical trial data and quality, Stephen is a good guy to know. So welcome, Stephen, and thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you, Spencer. My pleasure.
So why don't we start with the world of data and IRBs, since that's really how you and I first got connected. So maybe just a little bit of background for our audience. So we met around 2015. I was teaching at Harvard, and you graciously agreed to come and give some guest lectures in my course. And if I remember correctly, in the first year, I think you spoke on data security issues, but then later, you came back and sort of spoke to a broader array of issues in the world of research regulation and oversight. But although, we just sort of touched on some of your titles, I'd love to hear you talk a bit more about your journey through the clinical trials and IRB world. So, if you could say, like, what sort of drew you to the space initially, perhaps?
Sure. So it's complicated and not traditional. And I was trained as a hematologist at NIH and practiced in the intramural program, and was, I think, seduced, maybe too strong a word, but into informatics. I think had I been born a couple of generations later, I might have been a computer scientist. So I ended up being the guy who ran the network in the lab. And one thing led to another, and basically I ended up being the chief information officer of the NIH Clinical Center.
Yeah.
The interesting thing about that, and sort of what connects all this, is that, everything is about data. When I was at NIH, we used to talk about, and we were, back then, we were talking about a refresh of the electronic health record. And we used to talk about computers as cognitive extenders.
Interesting.
So, as a hematologist, the example I often used was, one of the key measurements we use to assess anemia is the hematocrit, which is the percentage by volume of red blood cells in blood. And that percentage is an artifact. I actually tried to look up where this test was invented and I couldn't find it, but it's at least 100 years old, probably more. Where you gathered blood, put it in a centrifuge, spun it down, and you saw how much of the proportion of the volume was the red blood cells. Well, no one does that anymore. And that's obviously a very derivative measurement. It doesn't tell you anything about the function or shape or size or volumes of red blood cells directly. And now we have all these tools, but we still train people to use hematocrits. It's like, why don't we have computers put things together in a way that, a hematologist looking at, or any physician looking at data about someone's blood actually sees something that's directly meaningful and corresponds to function. Instead, our electronic health records will now let us look at a screen of 50 hematocrit values and they'll draw a nice curve, but that really doesn't change anything. And so actually I've been out of the informatics world for a while, partly because I was quite disillusioned by the fact that we chose not to use computers for things like that. We chose to use them as more convenient filing systems and billing systems and other things. So I'm sure we'll get to sort of loss of mission as we discuss other issues today. But
so that's, why do you think that is? Like, is that just something kind of cultural about the practice of medicine?
I think it's hard.
Yeah.
It's always easier to, medicine. So to be fair, medicine is very tradition bound. Even though, my father was a doctor and he used to tell me when I was in medical school that everything he'd learned had turned out to be wrong.
Right.
And that's, that's not far from the truth today. I just read an article on depression and how the chemical imbalance hypothesis, which was all the rage 30 years ago, it's just a gross oversimplification, is not mechanistic. And, I think the article said, just because, the example is, just because aspirin brings down your temperature doesn't mean a fever is caused by an absence of aspirin. So, there's a lot of this sort of backwards logic that comes up. So I think that Electronic health records are, the kind of thing I talked about a new measure is hard. Electronic health records are really, really expensive to put in. They represent a huge investment for an organization. And in the end, I think, I don't expect we'll end up talking about the healthcare delivery system, but I think like many other things in America these days, the actual purpose of the system has been lost to some extent, and it now comes down to billing and coding and other things that are not fundamentally interesting to a doctor or to a scientist, but that, are interesting to others. They're interesting to those who pay the bills. Yeah. So it's, I think that's happened a lot, I'm sure.
Yeah. So maybe let's take a step further down the road here and sort of talk a little bit about your transition to the IRB world.
Yes.
Right. So, started as a, physician, got sort of involved in bioinformatics through the NIH. And then, how did you get plugged into IRBs?
So I think it's worth noting that because I think these are consistent, my interest in informatics and my talk about maybe having been a computer scientist in another life is not because data by itself fascinates me, or how you can do cool graphs and things. In fact, I was a physics major in college, and I remember an epiphany I had in my senior year where we watched a PhD student present their thesis, and it was two clouds of green dots that came together and then went away. And I was thinking, you're going to spend another 5 years making a movie like that? I mean, it's the human side of all this that's fundamentally interesting. And I think that was, when I talked about cognitive extenders, that's what computers should be. They should serve us. I think in the same way, IRBs are right at the center of the human side of scientific research.
Yeah.
And I think they raise fascinating issues. And I guess the other thing is, and I'll have to admit this, I think this was probably part of my journey from the beginning. In academic medicine, the way forward is to become more and more specialized, more and more of an expert on smaller and smaller piece of the world. And that's fine. I mean, we need that. But it wasn't what was interesting to me. I was always interested in seeing sort of the bigger picture.
Yeah.
And IRBs are at a unique place to do that, particularly high volume IRBs. I mean, we could talk about my experience in that role, but you see everything.
Yeah.
Everything that's going on, it's fascinating. And it's sort of the ideal job. So, it's a lot of different things.
Yeah. Well, maybe, let's unpack that some more. So, okay, you have, there you are with the ideal job, right? Like sitting on, as a chair, high volume IRB. Talk to me, like, what are you seeing? What sort of excited you the most?
So it was really interesting. I was president and CEO of Western IRB, which is a business job. It had nothing to do with the reviews. And it was a result of the founder of the company selling it. And for those of you who knew Werb was a great IRB. Mm-hmm. But, she wanted to retire, and she sold the company to investors. And they were looking for a CEO. I had an informatics background. They were at least theoretically interested in data, monetizing data. Did I say I had an MBA? I have an MBA. Right. So I was sort of, and that's another story. But and people who were watching all this. So Western IRB was the first IRB that was the transition to investor ownership. People said what a relief it was to get a doctor and a researcher as the CEO. They were worried it would be a finance person. Well, and I had been in the public sector my whole career. So I think I was a bit naive entering into this arrangement. And in fact, my interests and the interests of the investors for investor value, as opposed to subject protections and scientific interest and other things, were not entirely aligned, and left after 2 years. And I was offered the job of the executive board chair at Quorum Review, which was another for-profit private IRB, but was family owned. It wasn't investor owned. And from some of my earlier comments, that fascinated me. It was a successful IRB. We saw a lot of stuff. So I came in, and my training was shadowing my predecessor for a couple of weeks, and then I was expected to chair 5 meetings a week.
Wow.
So in addition to absorbing Robert's Rules of Order, I had a lot of catching up to do as far as research regulations and process and meeting management and other things. And at least in the beginning, for the first month, everything was new. You'd get a study, and it was wonderful. You'd learn all these things. You'd have wonderful discussions. I mean, the boards were great. They operated just as they should, with appropriate perspectives shared and discussed for as long as it took, and then determinations made in the best interests of research participants. It didn't take long, though, for me to realize that at that volume, I couldn't possibly remember everything I'd done.
Mm-hmm.
And the IRB systems we used, and I think are used by most, are really process systems that support the reviews.
Right.
And they don't, this is a huge topic, but they don't let you look easily at related decisions.
Right.
Over the 5 years, say that a protocol is under your jurisdiction, it's hard to even go back and understand why the board made the decisions it did on the same protocol before, much less on a related protocol.
Yeah.
From a personal perspective, I started by just sort of keeping an electronic notebook that was cross-referenced, but it soon became clear that I had to develop something that would let me do this. And so I developed my own really electronic database / notebook for IRB determination, so that before a meeting, I could share with all of the other board members who would be reviewing and discussing the item, all the background I had, what we'd done in previous things, why. So IRBs record their deliberations in minutes. What's required to be recorded in minutes is really only controverted issues.
Mm-hmm.
And even in that case, minutes are an institutional and corporate liability. And so you put as little as you possibly can. Right. They're really essentially useless for actually understanding why people make decisions. So the job would have just been a drudge had I not had some system that allowed me to learn and to build. So I built one.
Yeah.
And that was great. And I'm not aware of any other IRB that uses anything like that. And you and I have talked. It's not just about the decisions you've made on that protocol. I mean, I think that it's obvious to me that we owe investigators and research participants at least justified inconsistency in our decisions. So otherwise we're arbitrary.
Yep.
It's not that we're arbitrary. We don't even know if we're arbitrary because we have no idea what we did before. And I think that's a disservice to everyone. And it's easy to fix, but it's not been a priority for systems that are designed like electronic health records to support process and billing and other things. I was with Quorum until it was sold to another private equity investment group. And then my position was redundant and it was eliminated. It's always a challenge, a personal challenge, to think back to how things would have been and what my perspective would have been had that not happened, and whether. Yeah. But I didn't have to make that choice, which is good and bad. And I started North Star Review Board as a nonprofit IRB because I think the mission of the IRB to protect research participants and to support the responsible conduct of science fits squarely in the requirements for 501c3, and the IRS agreed with me. So
yeah,
there we are.
Yeah. Going back a step to your earlier comments, right? About, you creating this, whatever you want to, well, how would you describe it? I mean, would you say it's sort of like I would be tempted to describe it as kind of like a, knowledge vault almost, but yeah.
I think that's right. There's been a lot of talk within the past 5 or 6 years about IRB precedent.
Yeah.
And a lot of the people who are in the IRB world and in the bioethics world have a legal background. And so precedent makes a lot of sense to them. And they hear this problem and they think, oh, precedent, that's how we do it in the courts. That's a very structured and well-defined system that I think is really hard to implement for IRBs. I mean, we don't know what the standards should be. So, when I created this system, what it allowed me to do, several things. It allowed me to look back over the history of a protocol and see all the notes I had taken, including notes in meetings and other things. So that was within protocol consistency. It allowed me to look at any protocol that was from the same sponsor or looked at the same intervention. And I kept a database of interventions because the names changed, obviously, over time as their products were developed.
Right.
And then, so that was sort of consistency across sponsors, across just sort of thinking. Then, what often happens too is you'll get a safety report. As an IRB, you'll get a safety report, an unanticipated problem or something else on a product. And you might have 8 protocols that study that product. And it's submitted by an investigator on a single protocol. We could, as the IRB, you could wait for the sponsor to submit it on the other protocols if they thought it was appropriate. But really, you now have safety information on that intervention in hand.
Right.
And you should be able to look back at all the other protocols and see whether this is relevant and whether you should ask for a report in the context of these other protocols, and whether the consent needed to be changed, all the other things that IRB does. So it did that as well. And then the thing that you and I have talked about extensively is the issue of uninformative research. So IRBs, one of the problems with the way IRBs operate is that they look at protocols one at a time. So you can look at the scientific design and you can say, yeah, in an ideal world, you enroll this number of patients and you'd be able to answer the question. That ignores that there might be 10 other protocols that are going after the same protocol, the patient population. That's sort of the easy piece. I think IRBs are discouraged from looking too deeply at science, and I get that. I mean, the IRB is not the expert on the science, the researchers are. But researchers are biased. That's why we have IRBs.
Yep.
And so it really is important not to sort of look at the mechanism and question that, but to look at the assumptions underlying recruitment and to see whether what you're seeing in front of you is actually achievable. Because if you can't answer the question, particularly if the protocol represents risk to people, you're asking people to take on risk in full knowledge that they won't, that their contributions are not going to be meaningful.
Yeah.
I think, and then the other piece is, the issue of what other, the question may have already been answered. So right. I think there are lots of Me Too protocols. There are investigators and investigator autonomy has an academic tradition. And maybe they're framing it quite slightly differently, but again, you're asking people to put their minds and their health on the line. And if the question was 95% answered, or even 100% answered by someone else, you shouldn't be doing the study.
Yep.
IRBs have no tools to look at that. And I think that's pretty basic ethics.
Well, why don't we sort of transition then and talk a little bit about the Government Accountability Office put out a report in January of this year, 2023, So they reviewed the existing laws and regulations, as well as some of the recent literature around IRBs and IRB guidance. They looked at registration data about like how many IRBs are out there. They looked at drug applications, inspection data from FDA and the Office of Human Research Protections, who had inspected some IRBs. They also conducted some interviews with officials and other folks from 11 different IRBs. Now, broadly speaking, the main finding is to summarize it, I guess, no one is really paying sufficient attention to what IRBs are doing. It seemed to be kind of what they found. As well as nobody's even looking to see, well, IRBs actually, just like you said, are they actually fulfilling their mission? Are they protecting human subjects? Well, but that's sort of high level, but I'd be curious, what were your thoughts on the report and sort of what's jumped out at you as kind of the most significant findings?
Well, I don't know if you captured me laughing when you brought up the topic.
It's probably on camera.
I think it missed the point. So the genesis of the GAO investigation was a letter, and I don't remember what year, at least 4 years ago, issued by Senators Warren, Sanders, and Brown, that really observed the fact that there was enormous consolidation in the IRB industry, right. that much work by IRBs was done now by private equity in private equity funded companies. And they asked what protections were in place, given the obvious interest. Those are investor-driven companies. What checks were in place to make sure they paid appropriate attention to research participant protections? And that led eventually to the GAO investigation. I would have loved to have known what 11 IRBs they talked to.
Yeah.
But I think their findings were, as you summarized, that FDA and OHRP don't do enough inspections, so that there's no check, even that what IRBs are doing is compliant with the regulations. Right. That's what that answers. And then the other major observation is that we have no idea what IRB quality means. So are we protecting participants? What does it mean to protect participants? So I think all of those are right, but there's a long history. Office of Human Research Protections, OHRP, has gone through periods when it was very active in inspections. So when I was chair of the Secretary's Advisory Committee, SACARP, we were asked to comment on an OIG report, Office of the Inspector General, that questioned whether OHRP was sufficiently independent. The genesis of that report was that there was a trial called Support, which was about oxygen levels in premature infants. And OHRP really came out critical of the consent form. Yep. Because they felt it did not disclose the risks appropriately. There were other issues with the trial, as one woman who testified before Congress said, they come to you you have a premature baby, they come with you, say with a protocol called Support. Are you not going to sign on? So there were significant issues, scientific and ethical. I don't know what the right answer was. Lines were drawn, but the NIH, I think, bridled at OHRP's interference. And officials at the NIH published New York Times editorials critical of OHRP. They didn't respect the usual internal government things. And OHRP's budget, particularly when compared to the growing budget for NIH and other research, has been shrinking for decades. Mm-hmm. So to suggest that OHRP is not doing enough inspections, absolutely true. The reason they're not doing enough inspections is because other parts of the government and industry are not interested in them doing inspections and are cutting their resources so they can't do inspections. So to put the issue as an OHRP or FDA, I think the same observations apply to FDA. Yeah. To put those on the FDA or OHRP really ignores what's going on and sets us up for another round. They'll get a boost in funding to do inspections. They'll shut something down that someone doesn't like, and then their funding will be cut. And we won't hear about any of that. No one hears about the OHRP budget or the portion of the FDA budget that's allocated for inspection. So you have these very visible things, and then they go away and things return to normal. So I thought that, yeah, to not recognize that dynamic that led to those lower inspections, I think is short-sighted and just invites more of the same.
Yeah.
I also think it's true that an aggressive inspection campaign from OHRP and from the FDA would burden researchers. It would likely reduce research volumes. But research volumes are not an end in themselves.
Right.
I mean, product of research, which we seem to have lost track of. The NIH within the last year or two put out a revision to their genomic data sharing policy. And there's a statement in there that just drove me crazy. They say that, the success of the existing policy has been demonstrated because there have been 50,000 studies or tens of thousands of studies that have used this data. It's like, okay, but you're talking about genomic data, individual privacy. It doesn't matter how many studies have been done. What's the impact been on public health?
Yeah.
And so we just have all of this stuff asked backwards. And I think, it's like the aspirin and fever thing. With investor-owned IRBs, if you follow the dogma that the purpose of the corporation is, value to investors, then you expect value to investors to ensure research participant protections. But if you follow the mission, it should be that protection of research participants leads to value to investors. And those things are not the same. I mean, it's a logical fallacy to equate those two things. But people do it all the time. They pretend that that's not an issue. And I think this is more of the same. The other part of the report, which you mentioned, is that we really don't have a generally accepted measure of the quality of IRB review. And I think in the absence of such measure, we've fallen back on compliance, regulatory compliance, which should be, if everything's working right and enough inspections are going on, the regulations are supposed to ensure, define the parameters of protections. Well, there are some problems with that. And the other thing that you can measure is client service, which is sort of how fast you do reviews. And so those have become the measure of IRB quality, if you will. But the regulations were never intended to be used like that. So the research, if you look at the approval criteria for research that an IRB is supposed to follow, the first one is that risks are minimized. And the second one is that the potential benefit of answering the scientific question justifies the risks that remain. Pretty basic questions, but very subjective.
Yep.
So who gets to judge whether risk is acceptable or not? Who gets to judge what the impact will be of the science? Who gets to judge whether risks are sufficiently minimized? And the reason, the regulations totally recognize the subjectivity of those requirements. And that's why we have, requirements for IRB membership. It's not the scientists sitting there and deciding. That's what we always did before. And history has shown that does not work. And so you have these other individuals who get to opine on that. There's nothing in the proposed measures or anything that's talked about that talks about decisional quality. Were all the voices heard? Yes, you checked that some person is not an employee and is not employee of the board and doesn't have a scientific background. Does that mean that individual can knowledgeably speak to the concerns of research participants? And, in the interests of investor value, the size of IRBs, the actual number of people who do the reviews, has decreased constantly.
Oh, interesting.
Down to the minimum. And there's no attention to that quality. There's no attention to decisional quality. And this is not unique to investor-owned IRBs. This is true in academic IRBs. I know of an academic IRB that will review 40 protocols, 40 items. Some of them are new protocols, some of them are amendments, other things, in 2 hours.
Yeah.
It's just on the face of it, you can check the boxes so that you appear to be compliant with the regulations, but that cannot possibly be quality of review.
No, you couldn't even read 40 abstracts in 2 hours and understand them. Right.
And the reality is that most of the people sitting on that board have read maybe one thing if they're presenting and nothing else. and they get the 2-minute spiel from someone who's made up their minds. And I think that, the other thing that's gone on is the individual who's assigned the responsibility to present the science to the board does all their work ahead of time, and it's shared in an electronic system. So basically the meetings become a rubber stamp.
Right.
And I have to say, in addition to that being I think, a betrayal of research participants, quite frankly, and their protections, I think it also entirely devalues the IRB process. I talked about this as the best job in the world. What made it the best job in the world was the science and sitting around a table with colleagues you respected, talking about it and talking about significant issues. If you don't have the time to do that, there's no quality in your work time. You'll spend as little time as possible. And it just basically devalues and undermines. So I don't know how to measure that. But I think what the GAO report calls for, which is convene a group of stakeholders to determine what IRB quality is not going to get to that. I mean, it's just not. It's going to be, we can't really measure parts. So the IRB system as a whole, I think we have to acknowledge, has had a huge positive impact.
Yeah.
We haven't had another Tuskegee, at least that we know about. Occasionally things come up, but they're of an entirely different scale. I think it works, just knowing that there's independent review works. So against that, how do you measure whether a specific IRB is preventing preventable harms? Prevention of harms is a really hard thing to measure anyway. So I think that's the wrong way to approach it. I think we should be assessing, decisional quality, meeting contributions, things that are hard and don't lend themselves to quick numbers, but that are real measures of the quality of what the IRB does.
Well, why don't we transition then there to another point, which, when we were arranging this conversation, you suggested that one perspective you wanted to share is the idea that everything is data, right? So super intriguing, would love to dive into that. Everything is data. Like, what does that mean to you? And then how does that sort of intersect with these issues that we've been discussing?
That comes, I think, from the trajectory of my career. And it also comes from the fact that IRBs are part of the research enterprise. Yeah, they have to make independent decisions and all of that, but they're part of the bureaucracy, they're part of the enterprise. The issue we discussed earlier about precedent and consistency, I'm not sure why the decisions an IRB makes, say in FDA-regulated research, are not held to the same standard when you have a marketing submission as the data to support the safety and efficacy of the drug. It's just not there. You have 6 people who sit in a room, all bringing their different perspectives. They discuss it. They bring their personal biases, because we all have biases. You don't learn, because if you don't capture those decisions and their rationales, you will not learn from them. So I'm trained as, undergraduate physicist and doctor, all of these things, medical researcher. I'm used to quantitative data. I'm not a qualitative researcher. And so, we get out of my area of expertise when you talk about actually how to do this, but that's not a reason not to do it.
Right.
And I think that it's really important data. The data from the IRB should inform not only the IRB itself, but how the IRB, that when the research regulations were passed, they were based on very traditional Enlightenment era ethical principles. Now we have, genomic research, germline genomic interventions. We have ubiquitous data sharing.
Yep.
And issues of privacy and what that implies. We have things that, we haven't, even if you look back at those principles and try to apply them, and they're pretty good principles, no one's talked about how to do that. We have to learn how to do that. And in addition, society, the demographics of our society are quite different than they were in the 1980s. And the things that are political issues that bother people, where people don't feel appropriately served by their country, are matters of ethics at some level and change, evolve over time. Why shouldn't we be evolving with them? So I think unless we collect data of some form, and unless that data is available and transparent, we can't pretend we have anything to do with science. And we're also missing a huge opportunity. So the other issue about this, we're at a crisis in trust. Mm-hmm. The pandemic illustrated that. You can talk about whether that crisis comes from behaving in an untrustworthy fashion or whether it comes from political manipulation. It doesn't matter. We're in a crisis of trust. The requirement for IRB review was instituted after Tuskegee in response, I think, to get ahead of what was inevitable public distrust in the research enterprise, particularly the government-funded research enterprise. So we have this tool, the IRB system, the system for ethical oversight. No one even knows it's there. Yep. So I mean, if we're trying to rebuild trust, shouldn't we be trumpeting this and making this as robust and transparent as possible? I mean, people are going to disagree with IRB decisions. And of course they are. And people don't have to participate in research. But the general sort of trend of what we find acceptable should be refracted through the lens of society. And we need transparency. And it's disappointing. The GAO report, the government should be trumpeting the fact that we have this system and should be looking for ways to make it accountable and to the public, to research participants, and should be using it as a tool to start to address some of the issues of distrust. Yes, we can't say whether people behave this way or not or why, but going forward, we have this system where independent people are looking, that would be huge.
Yeah.
But it's not talked about.
No. I mean, you're right. If you think about what we saw with the, vaccine, during the COVID pandemic, right? And just kind of the skepticism that people had about the research. And, some of that is, healthy skepticism actually, but it does seem like, look, the fact that there is this system in place to help, review studies, right? And, and protect the research subjects. Like, it seems like that was totally lost, right? It's just.
Oh, yeah. And I think that people, in the scientific community are not willing to admit how little we actually know. Yeah. I mean, that's just endemic and it's probably always been that way. But we have to be honest about medicine. As my father said, everything he learned changed. Right. And I have to say, many of the things I've learned have changed. And we shouldn't be telling people we have the answer. We should be telling people we're trying to figure it out. This is our best information at present. This is why we think it's this way. And data is the best way to do that. And that's what we're doing.
So why don't we move now to, we have our 3 questions that we like to ask everybody, if you're ready for them. So the first is, what do you see as the biggest data gaps in the field out there? So you sort of touched on this, but curious if you might, elaborate or, yeah, go ahead.
So IRBs, it's a huge data gap. I mean, there's no data. And what data there is held within corporate and academic walls. It's not shared. It's just contrary to any data governance and data sharing and data purpose. So I think for IRBs, that's just a huge issue.
Yeah.
And it's not hard to solve. I mean, it's not hard to solve, but the resources will come out of what would otherwise go to investor profits or, other parts of institutional budgets. IRBs at institutions always struggle for funds because, as people say, they're not profit centers. When I was in the academic world, the idea that you were judged by whether you were a profit center or not for your institution would have been quite strange. But that seems to be the world we're in now.
All right, question number 2. What excites you the most about the future of research?
So, I go back to this business about cognitive extenders. I think we have unprecedented tools. I don't happen to think they're being used for interesting things in the largest part, and they're typically being used for commercial, not scientific purposes. But I think, we're at a different stage for how, the tools we have to analyze data. And I think properly used, that's revolutionary. And we could really, I don't see, obviously AI and big data and all these things, I don't see them replacing physician decision-making, automating physician decision-making. But I see them providing us much better insights into disease. I mean, I think about how complex sort of the immune system has turned out to be with all of the different subclasses of cells. No one can hold that in their head. You build a neural network or some other kind of, which you test, and, suddenly you have just tools that you never had before. I know some people have talked about using AI for IRB decisions. I'm not sure that's appropriate. I think that's a bit of a stretch to me, and I'm not sure it gains us anything. But in terms of science, wow, what a time to be alive.
All right, question number 3 is the wave the magic wand, right? If there is something that you could wave a magic wand and change about research, about the industry, what do you think you would pick?
Well, so I would say that's easy.
Yeah.
I would say make all IRBs nonprofit.
Okay.
Just take that issue out and return them to their mission. And that's my little, I think it goes to a deeper issue of mission being lost. And I've heard conversations where, people are pricing gene therapy drugs at, $4 million an application, because what's it worth to the individual to be cured? What's the future cost to society? To me, I don't get that. If you have a genetic disease treatment for sickle cell disease, everybody who has sickle cell disease should get it. And it should be priced so it wouldn't be hard to price it to make a good profit and to decrease the nation's healthcare costs significantly. Instead, we have these crazy ideas. So I think in all these domains, we really have to remember why we're doing things. Money is rarely, it's a tool. It's rarely a purpose. So I just, that's a broad societal comment. I think we've sort of lost our way, and we've certainly lost our way with IRBs.
Well, Stephen, thank you so much. Really appreciate the time. Fascinating discussion with you as always. Anything else you want to share?
No, I think this was great. Always a joy, Spencer.
Thanks again to our audience. Please like and subscribe to always stay in the loop about the next episode, and we'll see you in the next one.